Hello, dear the Perplexed Club. I'm recording this relatively short video as a preparation for our discussion on Tuesday. We have several new people join in. And as an introduction to this, I say that we've been doing it for several years now, and we pride ourselves in that we have people on various backgrounds, extreme political and religious affiliations, to extreme right, to extreme left, communists, capitalists, Karaites, Hasidim, mainstream religious, Zionists, not Zionists, everybody. And the purpose is to express the view and listen to another point of view with attempt to understand what the person is saying. Oftentimes we'll find that people who join our club, after the first or second meeting, they leave in disgust. And the reason for that, we find, is because psychologically we find people want to join the group that have similar views. And if our opposite view is accepted and your view is not accepted, if not view, and if your view is not accepted, people tend to be sometimes becoming hostiles, and the best in the best situation, just get up and leave. Well, we don't like to get up and leave. We like to listen to another person saying, and the key to that is to begin with, when people get together, already accept the fact that we like each other, we enjoy each other, we came together in the same room, in the same Zoom room, in order to talk about religion, politics, a little bit, art, medicine, sports, anything you want, and personal questions. Sometimes we get sometimes quite psychologically deep into our personal issues. Some of these recordings we don't post on the web, on the YouTube, because sometimes it becomes too personal. We decided those type of things we don't want to share, and we just don't post that. But most of it is posted. And on politics, the common thing is politics. You don't talk about politics, religion, because people sort of agree to disagree. Let's not talk about it. But we do talk about it, not to convince somebody else how wrong you are, how right I am, but to see what the person have to say. What do you believe in? Interesting. So the next topic, we decided, what's a connection between Pearl Harbor and Ukraine? So as you can see, we have a kind of goofy topics without any obvious connection. And we're finding that when people react on certain events, politically, even religiously, most people don't know, not experts in history. As far back we know, 20 years, 50 years, maybe 100 years, but the real background to what actually really happens, sometimes people forget. And if you look in the real background, you can see that the same event can be seen in a very different focus, very different perspective, and very different light. For example, when I left Russia, I was born in Russia, and I came to US when I was 25 years old. Always looked at America as a beam, what do you call it, a citadel of democracy, freedom, spreading freedom, democracy, and the good things to the world. If only would the world accept American Western values, the world will be much better off. Unfortunately, the world doesn't want to accept it. This is what I thought. And over time, my opinion a little bit changed. And whatever I say now, please don't take it insultingly, because this is just my views, and you might see it differently. Again, when I speak to people about it, people would, if they react negatively to my points, they usually react from a point, let's say we talk about Pearl Harbor. Well, Japanese were very cruel, very bad, attacked us. What did they attack us for? They destroy entire Pacific fleet in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor. Of course, it's a declaration of war, so we went against them. Eventually dropped the 2 nuclear bombs. So that's as far back as people think, and they feel we're justified in responding to such a horrific atrocities that were imposed on us, and also Japanese and to Chinese and so forth. But not often we'll look back a little bit. And if you look back in the history, let's say you go in the beginning of 19th century, it's only like maybe 250 years ago, and you think about it, and you can open up the books, go to a library, or maybe even on the internet, and you'll find that the dominant powers in the world relatively recently were, of course, British Empire. That was, skipping from Roman Empire to the British Empire. Then was um, Denmark was pretty strong at one point. British Empire. Eventually, U.S. became dominant empire. So those British Empire, primarily because the sources of energy, coal at that time, before oil, it was coal. So Britain expanded all over the world, and also in the British minds, they were bringing to the world enlightenment, good things, religious values as well. And if you go to India, it's good for the Indians. If you go to the Far East, it's good for us. Southeast Asia, good for them. That's a mentality that justifies the expansion of British Empire. Of course, from an economical standpoint, most people, if you live in London somewhere, you just work in the beginning of 1810 or something. And the things are done by politicians and people who are in a big business. Like maybe 1 or 2% of the society handles that. The rest of the people just basically want to make sure they have food on the table. And if you look at Charles Dickens, you can see the life for most people wasn't that great, but people at the top lived pretty nicely. Government, politicians, and so forth. So expansion of the British Empire also reached the Southeast Asia. And when I say Southeast Asia, it's Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, eastern portion of the China, Japan, Guinea, and the area, I don't have a map in front of you, but you imagine Southeast Asia. Think about Japan, and around Japan, Indonesia, and so forth, almost dipping down to northern Australia and New Zealand, Southeast Asia. So to expand into these new markets, but the key to that was to expansion to China, to take foot strong in China. From there, essentially, you went to Southeast Asia. So Britain actually had an agreement with China to open up Chinese market. And that was a little bit unfriendly takeover, so to speak. And Chinese really were just a closed society. We're not very culture, Confucius philosophy, we know Chinese history. They were not really a Western-oriented freedom and light spreading around the world nation. So that treaty between Britain and China was essentially imposed on Chinese by force, sometimes by pilgrims telling how great it is for them, and then eventually, but if you don't like it, then we have other means to make you understand how good we are. So Britain started to dominate that area of the world, and later on, when the coal subsided, when oil came in, and that's why Iraq got formed and Saudi Arabia discovered its oil, which is relatively recently, let's say 150 years ago or something like that. At that point, Britain's dominance of the world started to decline. Coal was no longer the thing. It was oil. The US has a lot of oil. Russia, northern Siberian area has a lot of oil. And of course, Middle East has a lot of oil. In Southeast Asia, there is some oil, but not that much comparing to US and the Middle East. So Americans in the beginning of the 19th century, 1840, 1850, felt that it's time to expand markets out into the Europe, into Southeast Asia. And the key for that was not to opening China. China was already opened, quote unquote, by Britain, and US had presence in China, and Japan was the place to open. And Japan, a relatively small island, so to speak, but it has a lot of influence because at that time, Japan was a very peaceful nation. It's a very tough culture. It's a very good culture, very traditional, long history of the Japanese people. Samurais, honor, respect. Those are Japanese values. Sometimes, unfortunately, with that, there's also cruelty, as I'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, the idea to open up Japanese market was from a three-pronged standpoints. One was economics. We need our goods. The U.S. is expanding, growing. We need to get new markets. Southeast is a great market. We're already in China. If we crack Japan, then the rest of it, all the Korean and other markets will kind of come together. That was a policy. The second tier to this policy was also a religious aspect. That yes, in America, it was believed that the Christian values must be introduced to the backward civilizations, America, the West, considered Japan as a backward civilization. At that time, by 1850, 1854, Japan was closed country. They had official policy of neutrality, not getting involved with the world affairs. It was an enclosed society, closed markets. We don't want to trade with you, don't come to us. That was the policy of Japan. America eventually will get to that point after 1850s, but at that time, they were still expanding the influence. There was a lot of, Texas, in Arizona, in all the areas where the oil is produced in California. Oil flooded America, and at that time, excess oil was essentially available for sale. So American sent, the president was Fillmore, 1853, 1854. He sent his Commodore Matthew Perry with several ships, military expedition to Japan, with a peaceful mission to open Japan, peaceful mission. And Perry, in his memoirs, is telling how he looked down on Japanese culture. There's backward Japanese cultures, people walking with funny suits, funny shirts, and America, of course, already America by then. So Japanese were pressed into signing the treaty. The treaty was called, I'm reading here, Treaty of Kanagawa. I didn't know for a while, but if you look it up, Treaty of Kanagawa of 1854. 1854, that in that treaty, Japan, essentially, very proud nation, thought, well, listen, Americans and British already forced China into it, and we're a small island. We're not very powerful nation. We have not much of a choice. So they entered into this treaty, and America felt it's a great success. Now Japanese markets are open. At the time, the only thing that Americans can get silk products from China, and oil, obviously, with great supply to Japan. Relatively quickly after that, Japanese society transformed. It started to come out from the enclosed country with a backwards medieval mentality to industrialized nation. Once they get a taste of that, and I would say unfortunately, but once they get a taste of that, they say, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing. We can be like a great empire, like Britain used to be before US kicked in. And of course, they have no natural resources to speak of. The main thing they do was silk production, textiles. But Japanese very industrial, very inventive. That's the reason why when they have nothing, they have to import. And they started to import from US. Well, before the treaty, basically, it was agricultural society. You don't need much technology. Grow rice, have fields, have a couple of houses, nice green gardens. Everybody's happy and peaceful. Typical Southeast Japanese, Chinese cultural mentality. But now they're exposed to Western civilization relatively quickly, reluctantly, and by force. But eventually they get a taste of that. And once you get a taste of that, wow, we can actually become a great industrialized nation. They started to think, and within Japan, then two camps emerged. One camp with the emperor actually was resisting that trend because they like people camp. They felt that it is not their culture. They've been dragged into industrialization of modernity they don't need. But another side, including military, felt that that's a great opportunity for Japan. So they started to look for getting the oil from America, quickly transformed Japan to industrial base. Now you have oil. Also metal scraps start to come from the United States. Well, Japanese started to look, not being really that stupid, they started to look, how can we be not quite dependent on US? Now that we have a taste of the Western world, how can we keep that pace, but without depending on the guy who imposed it on us? So they started looking in the neighboring China, Korea. And in China, in Manchuria, which is the northeastern portion, almost by Sakhalin, by Russia, South Russia and Mongolia, in Manchuria, there's a significant oil reserves. Not as much as in America or in the Middle East, but significant. So Japanese initially tried to negotiate with Chinese. Listen, let's borrow, rent, lease some land from you. And they did to get oil to us, so we'll have less dependency on America. But eventually that led also on cultural conflict. And one thing led to another, one thing led to another. It came to the point the Chinese basically said, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want any interaction with you. Japanese at that point said, no, we have to have it. And it led to the war. Japanese-Chinese war, basically for the dominance by Japan of the oil fields in Manchuria, the portion of China. That, of course, is not fair from the standpoint of Japanese towards China. But now with the background, I want us to understand why it happened and what led to that. During the war, Japanese were very cruel, very, very rough. And the atrocity they commit against Chinese are hair-raising, horrible. That's horrible. Those atrocities were presented to the world. The whole world, with America and Europe, said, well, what's going on here? How can people do these horrible things? And America started to put pressure on Japan, stop that. In other words, don't go to China. Don't do this atrocity. Stop the war and stop getting the oil. We're giving you the oil. Buy it from us. If that would land on this, if somehow that agreement will continue, perhaps oil will continue flowing to Japan. But by then, Japan became very militarized. It was past the civil and nice, cool society. It was just a few decades prior to that. And Japan started to do something that we need to have some partners. We are now in hostile territory. China is against us. America is beginning to frown on us. Denmark, Dutch don't like what we're trying to get from the oil fields peacefully first. And they essentially concluded a treaty with Italy and Germany. So that's the axis of Germany, Italy, Japan. Now, in most people's minds, that's a horrible thing. Now you can think about Japan as a Nazis, fascists. That's not how they saw it. They knew who Hitler was. They knew who Mussolini was. But they had, in their standpoint, it's so far. We're not getting to the politics of it. Perhaps they should have thought about it, but they didn't. They felt this is a partner that together with Germany and Italy and us, we're going to push Americans out of influencing into our business. And in that, Germany, Italy, and Japan were in congruence. Americans can see that. They can say, now, Japan is supporting Nazi regimes of Mussolini and Hitler. They're cruelly massacring hundreds of thousands of people in China, and they cut off supplies. They cut off supplies, froze embargo on oil and scrap metal. So essentially, overnight, Japanese now lost the supply of the natural resources that they needed to produce all these wonderful things that started to produce, thinking to become industrialized titan of the nations in the world. FDR, Roosevelt, went to the Congress and presented to the Congress as, of course, a horrible thing. Well, Japan didn't know what to do. At this point, it was difficult for Japan to implode back to what it was, peaceful, small nation, nice and quiet. It already got a taste of industrialization. They already wanted to be like America, like Europe, like developed world, rich world, that Americans in Idaho, in Iowa, sitting in the backyard, drinking coffee and having beer, and have a lawnmower, and the lights illuminated their mansions because the lights coming from oil that Americans have and Japanese don't. They wanted to be like that as well, human nature. So Japanese, in desperation, decided a completely ridiculous plan, which in their mind also was ridiculous. The emperor of Japan knew that it would be very horrible consequence, but in their minds, they had no other plan. And what they did, they attacked Pearl Harbor. And that we know. Once a horrible things in Pearl Harbor, very quickly, within a day, American Pacific Fleet was destroyed. For most Americans, think about if you're sitting there in 1940s and you now all your thousands of people died and your fleet is destroyed. What the heck is this? Will be very big indignation about this Japanese I don't want to say the word, they're attacking us. Declarations of war. So FDR and the Congress authorized declarations of war. So now US and Japan are at war. Japan was hoping in their mind that hopefully they knew that will be consequences, but they thought there will be possibility that Americans, seeing that they in desperation, they attacked Pearl Harbor, will see it as a sign. Listen, guys, we're going to fight with you if you don't leave us alone. Americans also could have a choice. Say, okay, as horrible as it is, let's talk. Let's find out what do you want. We want resources. We put you on the path in 1854 to become the nation. We guaranteed your oil supplies and the metal supplies. And now we cut it off. We're going to restore all that. Now, please don't go against China. Maybe that will be a solution, perhaps. Or maybe they will convince China, because America had at that time big influence in China. Let them lease the fields of Manchuria. Let them get oil. Why not? You have extra oil, sell it to them. All that didn't happen because basically, and this is, you can disagree, but the way many people see it and I see it, American expansionist policy around the world, and we know better, we're Americans, we know better what's for you, of course we know better what's for us. There was no other alternatives. You don't go by what you want. You go by what I say. It's good for you economically. It's good for us economically. It's good for you culturally, civilizedly. It's a good thing. That's how Americans thought. And a guy on the street in America, in Idaho, in New York, in New Jersey, in California, probably thought, yeah, it's a great thing. We spread democracy and freedom and light to the nation. Why wouldn't they want that? Why wouldn't they want to open the market? In that light, if you look at it, this 200, I just gave you 200, 250 years of history. If you look at it from that standpoint, at least you can scratch your head and think about it. You may disagree, but don't jump immediately, well, they're very cruel people. They deserve to be attacked and dropping the bombs on them to finish the war. Now, of course, when the war started, Americans were fighting on the islands, on Japanese islands mostly. So Americans essentially was trying to take vengeance against Japan and defeat Japan, the enemy, the ally of Germany and Italy. At that point, in American minds, it was a righteous battle. Eventually, battle in Vietnam will be seen as a righteous battle. And the fights everywhere else is a righteous battle. You don't find Chinese warships somewhere in Canada or in Mexico trying to tell them that Chinese way of life is best. You don't find Saudi Arabia or Yemen sending their ships to attack New York. But American ships are all over the world with a noble, good goal to bring the light to the world, bring democracy. And many times people don't think about it. It's not quite as cut and dry. And there's a lot of counterpoints to my point. But take that point as well into consideration and think about it. This is what happened. Of course, eventually, things kind of settled down. After the war, Japan got rebuilt, despite these nuclear bombs we dropped on them. I think it's a criminal thing. But many people saying, well, that was necessary. Truman said, otherwise, the war will be dragging on. Well, the war would be dragging on if the American GIs were fighting on Japanese islands. If America would get out of Japanese islands and let Japan be Japan, there will be no need to attack Japan, and Japan would have no need to attack New Jersey. So think about it, what we did. But people who did this were not normal American people. 99.9% of people in the US have no idea what's going on. They saw it the way they see it on television and radio and the newspaper. But it's the top layer of politicians, news, and basically military complex, military industrial complex. It's a lot more money you make when you sell a couple of airplanes or oil than selling television sets or paper towels. So that is what runs the world today. People who make big bucks. It's a small percentage of population. They go to work, not like most people driving the car and taking the bus. They're going to work, that they have a chauffeur that takes them to work. And they don't make $30,000 a year. These people making a couple of $1 billion a year, personally, and their families. And they play golf, and they have a great, great time. And they say that's just American way. Well, it wasn't American way of the Mayflower people, because Mayflower people who came to America didn't come for that. They came for freedom of religious expression, away from Britain. And eventually that turned to industrial revolution, created the greed that said, I first want to take care of myself, my country, and I want to expand it myself to the rest of the world, to take the resources from them and sell them something, because they need that. Whether they want it or not, in our minds, American minds, yes, they do. That's a background. Now, switching because of a connection with Pearl Harbor in Ukraine, when you think about what happened in the Soviet Union, in 1991, when Soviet Union collapsed, Soviet Union would expand. Soviet Union and Germany are exception to this logic, to what I'm talking about. The conflict between Japan and the US, as I just described, comes in from desire to expand bucks. The buck stops here, basically American way. That's caused it, greed and dividends. But the Soviet Union communist mentality and the fascist Nazi mentality, that's a different situation. That has nothing to do with it has to do with economics as well, but basically there's also a lot of philosophy and psychology behind it. We want the world to be Soviet world, communism, brotherhood of man, or in German example, superior or one nation over other nations. So you have to pay tribute to us because we're a superior nation. That was Soviet Union and Germany. But when Soviet Union collapsed, out of 15 republics emerged essentially the big ones, Russia. And Russia went through the hard time for the first maybe 10 years after the collapse of Soviet Union. But when they collapsed, before they collapsed, if you think about it, Russia, Soviet Union dominated the Eastern European bloc of countries, such as Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, all these countries Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia were part of the Soviet Union, but the countries in between, there was Western Europe, NATO, and Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, Warsaw. And Soviet Union had essentially a big influence, essentially dominated in the middle, the Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. That country were under the heel of the Soviet Union, although not part of the Soviet Union. When Soviet Union, Warsaw, in other words, it's like Eastern NATO and Western NATO, NATO and Warsaw Pact. When Soviet Union collapsed, before they retook their troops away from this middle corridor of countries, they said, we're going to come out, but you guys don't come in. We'll stay here, Russia, not Soviet Union now, Russia, and you, NATO, Germany, England, France, you stay there. And in between, we're a neutral country like Sweden, like Switzerland, live and let live. If that happened, everything would have been fine, but it didn't happen. From that point on until now, Western NATO continuously expanded and it took over the middle countries, Poland, and then eventually Ukraine. In the last 10, 15 years, Ukraine has built probably the best army after the Russia in Europe, much from the coup that Nolan, the Secretary of State of the US, helped orchestrate. So Ukraine became very militaristically, always very corrupt politically, and very anti-Semitic always. We know that's a different story, different history. Now they got an opportunity to become, West will give us everything. We'll be just like America. We'll be Walmarts and Targets. We'll just sit and roll our thumbs and everything will be fine. If only we become part of the NATO. So, of course, U.S., it's NATO, but U.S., the main thing, pushed Ukraine into becoming part of NATO. The eventually president of Ukraine, Zelensky, welcomed that because he himself came from a comedian into the president from a few bucks a month he was making as a comedian to billionaire essentially within a couple of years. And the conflict now the NATO essentially was threatened to become a part of Ukraine. That is, Russia couldn't tolerate. So the similarity between the Pearl Harbor, so Russia invasion of Eastern Ukraine, protecting some of the Russian population there, as well as prevent NATO becoming within Ukraine, was similar resistance that Japanese expressed against US. Pearl Harbor was a victim of that policy, unfortunately. So Pearl Harbor became a clash point where Japan and US initially ignited. Japan did not win. Japan was a lot weaker. Japan knew it had no chance. Japan had to gamble. If Americans understand it and settle with us, it will be peace for everybody. But if they don't understand it, we are goners. And that is what happened. The bombs dropped on Japan eventually as a result, America being completely indignant and not willing to make any negotiations, but interested only to maintain our policy or else. Same situation is now reflected by American policy and NATO in Ukraine. We didn't get to the point that a flash happened to very catastrophic situations, Right now, Russia is in Ukraine, not Soviet Union. Mentality is very different between Soviet Union and Russia. Russia now feel that if NATO rockets are in Ukraine, it's a 4 minute flight from there to Russia. They have lost 20 million people in the war to another Nazi country, to Germany. They, in their mind, they don't want this to happen again. For Americans sitting Idaho, Iowa, in New Jersey, it's not that easy to understand. We Americans have not experienced the situation when we are under a mass attack and losing, God forbid, 20 million people. Russians, remember, today in Russian family, probably not a single family exists that don't have somebody who was a victim of that horrible Holocaust in Europe from a Germany. They don't have another Nazi regime, which they see in Ukraine and on their border. And they hoped that will be preventative if the West did not move in. But the West did move in, and the West moved in because American says, you shall move in. Now, as we are in August 20th, 2023, hopefully, eventually the West come to wisdom of that, compare what happens and say, listen, we have to sometimes let people live their own lives. And even if we don't benefit, even industrial military companies wouldn't benefit that much. But unfortunately, that's the price you pay. Otherwise, you can wake a sleeping giant, just like Japan woken a sleeping giant in America with a nuclear bomb to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to follow. The same thing, God forbid, could happen if Russia would threaten to the point they have no other places to retrieve but to use the extreme measures, which will be a nuclear holocaust. Right now, the essential in Ukraine, there's a war between U.S. and with NATO, mostly U.S. and Russia. But the people who are dying in the field, hundreds of thousands of people, are innocent Ukrainians. Not all of them innocent. There are a lot of Nazi fascist divisions, but many people drafted into army simply want to be home and not to be subject to this atrocity. That is what happened. That's what happens right now. This is the time to prevent it. And the way to prevent it is to understand the history. Just look back, not 10 years, not to get overly emotional. Well, they attack us. Who do you think they are? We need to attack them. But to think about it, what created that situation? Looking in the mirror, in our own action, analyze what happened. What business do we have in Afghanistan? What business do we have in nation building in Iraq, Iran, Russia, Southeast Asia? We have a plenty of territory in New Jersey, in America, from New Jersey to California. Cultivate this land, enough oil to live happily. And that same thing, if you look at the picture of every country, God gave us a beautiful land everywhere. We can help each other, but we cannot help each other if we have a hidden agenda, if we prescribe our way of life, even though it might be a good way of life to some other nations. And when you think about it, in 1960s, 1970s, if you look at American TV and a happy family, sitcoms, mom and dad and two kids, the cat and the dog and a car out there, and the father comes home, sitting down eating, paradise, American dream. But think about it, that American dream, those families didn't think why they're doing so prosperously. They probably attributed to the fact that this is America. In America, we just work hard. Well, other people also work hard. But a lot of this prosperity, a lot of these lights, a lot of these lawnmower things, a lot of these lawns and sprinklers on the lawn come from the energy. That energy comes from oil. That oil comes from Texas and California. And then when profits of the company who do they'll become not 27%, but only 25%, they want to look for other markets. And Southeast Asia, Europe, Australia, Middle East is a perfect opportunity for corporations to go and sell them the airplanes, F-15s and oil and whatever you want, not to Arab oil, but let's say to Japan in my example. So that is a greed that unfortunately drives humanity. And that puts a blemish on the Western civilization. The Western civilization with a capitalism is a symbol of great and wonderful, great humanistic approach that the West has. But there's another side to that. And another side has more hidden. That's greed. So those two sides could work against each other. If we let a good side prevail, then we'll take that industrialization, innovation of capitalism and take it to the good use. But if you try to make the rest of the world like us, try to expand our views and our norms and take care of the cultures that are not like us, it will only cause a conflict. So that is what a little bit history. And again, like I said, I am not a professional historian professor. You can look in the books, you can look at books or even internet and read on your own, but connect the dots. Try to see what happened. Don't react to emotional situations. Well, I mean, I in the end, I make a little example. Let's say there's two homes next to each other. And from one home, somebody comes in continuously, very strong guy, and surrounds another home with the trenches, and then tells them that now they can't walk through this street. They can only take like 5 miles detour, make their life very difficult. People don't like it. But let's say this big guy is not doing anything illegal. He just simply, that's his land, but he makes somebody else's life miserable. And he tells him, listen, let's be friends. You have strawberries in the field. I want to have strawberries. And I will give you soap in term or diapers, whatever you need. And then I'll treat you nicely. And the guy says, I don't want that. I don't like you. I don't need your diapers. I don't want to sell you my strawberry. I want to be left alone. But so, well, if that's the case, I'm gonna go and attack you. I'm gonna shoot at you. So eventually you can force the guy to the point and say, okay, fine, I take my strawberries. Oh, it's fair. Strawberries is a $10 for straw. Oh, everybody sells for $5. I sell for 10. Now the guy is making profit. And internally in their family, it could be a couple of family members that don't like it. And one night they come in and just break the windows of the rich guy, break the window, and God forbid, just kill somebody. Somebody gets hurt. And then the people in the big house will say, well, I got such a bad neighbor. They just killed our people. They just attacked us. Now it's a war. Technically, that is true. They attacked this guy. Now he's justifying his mind to go ahead and retaliate. But think about how it started. What situation? Personally, you can say shouldn't be put in that situation. But you put them in a situation, they have no other choices but do something to protect his way of life. Now, should the person will be not as vicious, not as cruel? True. But you have to understand the motivating forces, that you cannot force people into accepting your values and do what you say, jump when you say jump how high. But you have to respect that it's a different culture, different mentality. Leave them alone. Try to find prosperity in other ways. And if you don't quite get as huge prosperity and profits, maybe God didn't mean to give it to you. Maybe God meant to have another nation, another group of people also right to develop their way of life in more natural ways. It will be a better world if we just think about and connect the dots. Maybe we can talk about it. Again, you agree, disagree. It's not my intention not to present you a biased focus. I want to present to the facts what happened historically. And you can correct it. And you can say, I don't agree with you with this. I don't agree with this. That's fine. But I think it's a good discussion. That discussion, that's humanity. That's religion. And ultimately, that is God when you think of this. See you on Tuesday on Zoom. What's our Zoom? I'll remind our coordinates of Zoom. Here, put it on the screen. Yeah. 325-804-5811, password 285-775. It is every Tuesday at 8 o'clock in the evening, Israel time, or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, US time. See you there. Be good. Be good. God bless you.